Inevitably, the two systems of thinking illustrated throughout this chapter influence the ways in which we communicate. Much of the time we are guided by the impressions from quick and easy System 1 thinking, so communication will be more effective if it grabs attention, using simple expressions or rhymes, or using bright clear colors for writing. It is also subject to the same biases. People respond to requests to pay off their credit card bills differently according to the anchor with which they are presented. Suggesting a low minimum payment leads to people paying less than if a high minimum payment is suggested, and ends with lower actual payments overall. The higher the suggested minimum payment or anchor, the more people pay, and the greater the chance that they will pay off their bill completely. The processes that underlie thinking clearly influence our understanding and our behavior. The theory of linguistic relativity suggested that language fosters habits of perception as well as thinking, and that different views of reality were reflected in different languages. Eskimos supposedly had many different words for snow. However, this claim has been described by Steven Pinker as the Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax, with no supporting evidence behind it. We can understand the distinctions made in languages other than our own, but linguistic information alone does not prove the point. The experiment in Box 12 demonstrates how a combination of clear thinking, accurate observations, and cultural awareness may help to provide an answer to such questions. Concluding points. Work on the cognitive skills involved in thinking, reasoning, and communicating is still expanding, focusing for instance on the acquisition and development of these abilities, problems arising with them, interactions between them, and associated activities in the brain. Perhaps the point to emphasize is that, in order to function well and adapt as we go, we need to achieve a balance between knowing when to snap into action and when to stop and think. If we operated entirely on the basis of logic, like a computer, we would be unable to adapt flexibly to the complexities and uncertainties of the everyday world. Hence, there are still some respects in which our abilities appear superior to those of artificially intelligent machines, even though the machines may have larger memories and be able to test hypotheses faster than us. In particular, of course, we have feelings as well as thoughts, which may help us to understand why we do the things that we do. Box 12. Does language influence the acquisition of mental skills? Children speaking Asian languages do consistently better at mathematics than English-speaking children, and their number words reflect a base 10 system. First-year school children from 3 Asian and 3 Western countries were asked to stack blue blocks, representing 10 units, and white blocks representing 1 unit, into piles to show particular numbers. More Asian than Western children made 2 correct constructions for each number. The Asian children used 2 blocks representing 10 units more than the Western children, and the Western children used the single-unit blocks more than the Asian children. Conclusion: language differences may influence mathematical skills. The evidence is strengthened by the finding that bilingual Asian American children also score more highly on mathematical tests than do those who speak only English. Miura and colleagues. Box 13. Solutions. Solution to bat and ball problem, 5 cents. Solution to 9. Problem, box 11. This problem can only be solved by continuing some of the lines outside the boundary of the square defined by the dots, or by breaking the boundary in some other way, e.g. cutting the dots into 3 rows and arranging them in one continuous line. Chapter 5. Why do we do what we do? Motivation and emotion. Feelings do not just give color to our experience, or provide the emotional weather through which we travel. They serve a purpose. They provide an impetus to action, and we often explain our actions in terms of those things that we felt at the time. I thumped the table because I was angry, avoided speaking because I felt nervous, or found myself a drink because I was thirsty. Motivations determine the goals towards which I strive, and emotions reflect the feelings I experience along the way. In previous chapters we have thought about how the brain receives, stores, and works with information collected from the external world so that we can perceive, pay attention, learn, remember, think, and so on. But of course the brain is an integral part of the body in which we experience the feelings that accompany motivation and emotion. Needless to say, we are not aware of much of the neural activity that is going on when moved by our feelings, nor of the ways in which they interact with the processes of perception and cognition. Nevertheless, these affective processes help to explain why we do what we do. All these activities taking place in the brain have evolved so that when they function well, they help us to get what we want and to avoid what we do not want. So motivations and emotions influence the way we behave, whether that means taking action or deciding not to do so. Motivation, the pushes and prods. George Miller defined motivation as all those pushes and prods, biological, social and psychological, that defeat our laziness and move us, either eagerly or reluctantly, to action. The motives behind our actions are guided by several forces. Hunger is a biological motive, acceptance a social one, and curiosity a psychological one. So motivation is complex. Hunger, for example, is determined by external as well as internal factors, by the smell of newly cooked bread as well as by the emptiness of the stomach. If I am hungry, I look for food, and the hungrier I am, the harder I look and the longer I look. Hunger determines the direction, intensity, and persistence of my behavior, but it does not determine all aspects of my eating behavior. I may also look for something to eat when I have an ache in my heart and not in my stomach, or just because I have a habit of doing so when I return home. Understanding the intricacies of motivation is based on recognizing that its workings have evolved so as to help us to minimize physical pain and to maximize pleasure, something that the mechanics of reinforcement help us to do. If I eat when I am unhappy as well as when I am hungry, this is because it makes me feel better. My personal experience of the reinforcement contingencies involved has associated reducing the pain of unhappiness, as well as that of hunger, with the satisfaction that comes from eating. So signals that rewards might be available play a central part in explanations of behavior, and in explanations of variations in behavior. The processes that determine responses to reward signals are fundamental, and they have a biological basis in the brain. Nerve cells in the midbrain that release the neurotransmitter dopamine signal, reward, by becoming more active immediately after a reward, such as receiving satisfying food or drink. However, the brain works in a rather more complex way, using its ability to base predictions about the future on the sum of past experience. The calculations that it makes, according to this effective prediction hypothesis, are similar to those described for perceptual processes in Chapter 2, and they are illustrated in the study described next. Patterns of neural activity experienced in the past are coded and stored in such a way as to determine expectations about the future, and their responses are sensitive to whether or not those expectations are fulfilled. Activity in dopamine-releasing cells was recorded during an experiment in which a signal was associated with a squirt of fruit juice into a monkey's mouth. The cells responded immediately to the squirt of juice. After a while, the same cells started to respond earlier, immediately after the light flash that signaled the arrival of juice. Activity in the cells then preceded and predicted the expected reward, rather than responding to it. When the light flash continued but the monkeys were given no juice, activity in these dopamine-releasing cells declined. The suggestion is that the information provided by changes in activity in these cells indicates when there is an error in the prediction about reward. If the reward arrives as expected, the prediction is accurate and the background pattern of activity in the cell does not change. If the juice arrives unexpectedly, or if it fails to arrive at all, the prediction is wrong and signals from the cell change accordingly. They respond more if the reward is delivered and less if it is not, thus providing information about what to expect in the future. The details of this experiment, illustrating the different patterns of cell activity, are shown in Figure 10. Observations such as this suggest that all experiences, every event, object, and place encountered, are associated with a particular value, reflected in the activity of specific, dopamine-releasing brain cells. The value that something has for us determines whether or not we want it, are motivated to seek it out, and will take action to get it. Some of the things that we seek are inherently valuable to all animals: sleep, food, air, water, and sex, and taking action to get them is necessary for survival. Genetics and experience contribute a degree of variation in motivation, but these primary reinforcers usually retain the value they have acquired through years of evolution. Using the ability to make predictions, human beings, and other animals also, are able to make links between the things they value and others that are associated with them. so that the associated experiences acquire a value of their own and become secondary reinforcers. Primary and secondary reinforcers, once their value is established, work in the same way. We have all experienced habituation to specific rewards, so, for example, we no longer respond if we have had too much of a good thing and we respond strongly if deprived of it. 10. Reward signaling by dopamine neurons. Activity in dopamine neurons represents the error in our prediction of reward. There was no signal, so the monkey doesn't know when the reward will come. The unpredicted reward causes an increase in activity. The monkey knew when the reward would come. The reward causes no change in activity. But the monkey doesn't know when the signal will come. The unpredicted signal of reward causes an increase in activity. The monkey expects the reward to come, but it doesn't. The lack of the predicted reward causes a decrease in activity. The suggestion here is that reward processing regions of the brain act as a common neural interface to action across species. Of course, this is only part of the story, and there is as yet no adequate theory of motivation that accounts for all that is now known about human motivation. When it comes to understanding why we do what we do, we need to encompass both types of reinforcement, reflecting the value to us of satisfying physiological needs, as well as the value to us of satisfying higher-level needs in which cognitive factors are important, such as the desire to be liked and successful. Two contrasting theories illustrate the ways in which psychologists have thought about motivation: homeostatic drive theory and goal theory. The basic idea in homeostatic drive theory is that it is important to maintain a reasonably constant internal environment. Any move away from this, or imbalance, prompts action to restore the balanced state. The action is driven by the sense of imbalance, and continues until the balance is restored. The physiological effects of hunger send us to the kitchen, and eating what we find there reduces the disequilibrium, or discomfort, caused by the hunger. Drive reduction theory incorporates ideas about reinforcement into this basic homeostatic theory, suggesting that behaviors that successfully reduce a drive, like eating when you are hungry, will be experienced as pleasurable and thus be reinforced. The motivation to continue the behavior decreases as the drive is satisfied. We should therefore slow down or stop eating when no longer hungry. What we actually do will depend on a combination of motivation and learning. Some foods, like chocolates, are easy to go on eating even when no longer hungry. The theory explains some aspects of complex behavioral patterns quite well. Satisfying the need for attention may help, in this example, to re-establish a normal pattern of eating. However, the notion of drives does not apply to other aspects of behavior such as tasting a new Mexican salsa or eating the parsnips so as not to cause offense. Social, cognitive, and aesthetic factors motivate much of our behavior, and these cannot be explained by drive reduction theory without postulating a drive to match every contingency, a drive to listen to Schubert, and another for listening to Miles Davis, or to walk along the top of the hill. In contrast, goal theory attempts to explain why we do what we do in terms of cognitive factors, suggesting that the key to someone's motivation is what they are consciously trying to do, their goal. This theory suggests that people will work harder, and use more resources, when the goal is harder to achieve, and the harder the goal, the higher the level of performance. An experiment testing this theory in the workplace is described in box 14. Goal setting has been shown to improve performance in 90% of the relevant studies, and it is especially likely to do so under the following conditions. People accept the goals set, they are informed about their progress, they are rewarded for achieving goals, they have the ability to reach them, and they are appropriately supported and encouraged by those in charge. These findings have been usefully applied in work settings, although we still need to know why some workers set higher goals than others, and how the motivating forces mobilized by setting a goal interact with others. Research findings in this field have many practical applications, for example in helping us to motivate people to learn and to work, and helping us to understand and combat difficulties in motivational systems, such as those that result in obesity and difficulties in dieting. Box 14. Doing your best. Hypothesis: people given the hardest goal should perform best. Method: 3 sets of workers were given the task of cutting and transporting wood. working in small groups. The do your best groups were given no goal, the assigned groups were given a pre-assigned, hard goal, and participative groups were required to set their own specific hard goal. Result: the do your best group transported 46 cubic feet of wood an hour, compared with 53 cubic feet for the assigned group and 56 cubic feet for the participative group. Latham and Yuckel. Emotion. While motivations determine our goals, emotions reflect the feelings we experience when we have succeeded, or failed, in meeting our goals. All manner of feelings may be experienced along the way, in anticipation, at the time, or afterwards, and these feelings are a product of the neural interface to action which has interested numerous psychologists since the 19th century. This is a field full of complexities, partly because the different components of emotion do not consistently correlate with each other. The 5 components are physiological, expressive, behavioral, cognitive, and experiential. I can smile when I am sad and feel fearful before I have consciously perceived a threat, and this lack of correlation means that emotion cannot be properly studied or understood by measuring any one of its components. A further complicating factor is that 2 independent processes contribute to determining individual subjective experience. The level of arousal determines the intensity of a feeling, while contextual and cognitive factors determine its valence and precise nature. 11. A primary emotion recognizable in one of the gargoyles on an Oxford college. Cross-cultural and cross-species research initiated by Charles Darwin shows that facial expressions associated with fear, anger, sadness, surprise, disgust, and happiness are sufficiently similar to be recognizable in people from different ethnic groups and in some animals. However, a much greater variety of emotions can be identified at the experiential than at the physiological or expressive levels. There are as many types of smile and frown as there are people to express them and situations to provoke them. Furthermore, complex emotions like guilt and shame, which are strongly determined by cognitive factors such as what we think about ourselves, what we think others think, and by internalized social rules, are difficult to recognize accurately. Besides, we usually experience mixtures of emotions rather than pure states. Although there are common aspects of these feelings, so that you and I can both feel sad, recognize it in each other, and talk about it, our experiences of sadness will differ. The meaning that it has for me, and the way in which I express it, is determined by how it fits into my world right now, by my past experience, memories, thoughts, and reactions. And by how others have previously reacted to my sadness, by the pattern of firing in my brain cells that reflects the expectations and predictions derived from my personal experience. If others have told me to go away and stop bothering them, I may hide it or find it hard to talk about. An investigation of interactions between emotion, bodily sensations, and cognition found that if the emotion triggered by a particular event is both experienced and expressed, then the event is remembered better than if the emotion is experienced but not expressed. It sounds as if the act of expressing an emotion provides a stronger memory trace, or conversely, that keeping a stiff upper lip interferes with memory for emotional events. There are many ways of understanding the interactions between thoughts and feelings. According to the James Lange theory of emotion, which is well over 100 years old, changes in bodily responses are necessary for emotional experience, so sadness arises from crying and fear from running away, rather than the other way round. This can sound counterintuitive, as people tend to believe that they feel sad because of what has happened to them, or because of what they are thinking about or remembering. In this century it has become possible to identify and to measure minute bodily changes, and to demonstrate how bodily arousal, and the feelings associated with both motivation and emotion, interact with cognition, subjective experience, and behavior. Fine-grained neuropsychological studies have revealed how the brain operates in sufficient detail to map the functional architecture that links cognition and emotion. Much neural activity is generated automatically, and remains out of awareness. Laboratory studies have shown that it takes between 200 and 350 milliseconds for us to become consciously aware of incoming sensory information. Research on facial recognition shows that in under 200 milliseconds we can distinguish a face from a non-face, and categorize it as happy, sad, or neutral. So, information about affect is one of the basic ingredients being fed into all mental activity, and it links up with the processes of perception, attention, learning, and cognition described in the previous chapters. We know that the brain captures statistical regularities, learns how to discriminate the familiar from the new, makes predictions, and learns from errors. We now know that activity in the parts of the brain associated with emotion and with motivation is organized on the same general principles. Successful theories should provide an explanation of how we know that the situation we are in is dangerous, exciting, or safe, as well as a description of what is happening in the brain. A different approach to this problem is illustrated by cognitive labeling theory. According to this theory, emotional experience is determined by a combination of physiological arousal and the labeling, or interpretation, of the sensations experienced during that arousal. In order to test this theory, ingenious experiments were devised that involved varying some components of emotion while holding others constant, as described in box 15. The findings from these experiments show that what we experience is greatly influenced by cognitive factors, by what we know about a situation, how we interpret what happens to us internally and externally, and of course what we have learned and remembered about such situations in the past. Box 15. Do I know what I feel? Aim: to find out what will happen when people have similar physiological symptoms of arousal but experience emotionally different situations. Method: some research participants, supposedly taking part in a test of the effects of a new vitamin on visual skills, were injected with adrenaline and others were injected with a saline solution. Only some of those injected with adrenaline were correctly informed of its effects. While waiting for the drug to take effect, the participants were put in a situation designed to produce either euphoria or anger. Results: after the waiting period, the emotion the participants reported reflected the mood expressed by the stooge, and was clearly influenced by social and cognitive factors. Those who had received the adrenaline injection but had not been correctly informed of its effects were most emotional. They were most likely later to report feeling relatively happy or irritable, according to how the stooge had behaved. Those who had been correctly informed responded less strongly to the behavior of the stooge and appeared to attribute their experience at least partly to the injection. Conclusion: our awareness of the situation we are in influences the emotion that we actually feel, but our physiological state determines how strongly we feel it. Schachter and Singer. Despite flaws in these early experiments, cognitive labeling theory had a major impact, and subsequent research into cognitive aspects of emotion has contributed much to the understanding of emotional distress and to the development of psychological treatments. Cognitive behavioral therapies, particularly for depression and anxiety, are based on the idea that thoughts, feelings, and behavior are so intimately related that changing one will change the others. As it is difficult to change feelings directly, cognitive behavioral therapies attempt to change them indirectly by working in therapy to change thinking, finding new ways of seeing things or developing new perspectives, and testing these out in practice. For example, the loss of a relationship may be interpreted as meaning that I will never find another partner, a thought which makes me sad, and which makes it hard for me to get out and meet more people, but it could also be interpreted as meaning that, although I am understandably upset, I still have the characteristics that my lost partner found attractive and can still make new friends. In other words, understanding more about the cognitive aspects of emotion has helped us to understand more of the intricacies of the relationships between thoughts, feelings, and behavior in general. In turn, this has guided the development of cognitive behavioral therapies, which are demonstrably effective in helping people who are experiencing a wide range of emotional difficulties. There is evidence that the part of the brain called the limbic system functions as an emotional center, and that the layers of convoluted gray matter developed later in evolutionary terms, thereby adding the ability to think about feelings, amongst other things. Information travels speedily and directly into and out of the limbic system, only reaching centers of cognition later, thus making us susceptible to emotional hijacking. The burst of anger or paroxysm of fear that overtakes us despite our having decided to remain calm and in control of our sensibilities. In extreme fear we may react primitively by running away, or more thoughtfully by helping others first. A primitive reaction to hunger might involve eating anything available, and a more reasoned one involves holding back or not giving in. So strategic behaviors are needed to combat the pressure from more primitive systems, and these give rise to all manner of complex emotions ranging from self-satisfaction to unsatisfied longing. The evolutionarily primitive aspect of emotion helps to explain its power to disrupt thinking. When we are emotionally upset and complain that we can no longer think straight, we are in fact quite correct. The frontal lobes play an important part in working memory, and they cannot function well when activation in the limbic system is dominant and demands full attention. This observation focused the attention of psychologists on finding out how control over emotions is acquired, and it has many practical applications, such as helping to change attitudes towards disruptive children who are slow to learn. Those who are distressed and disturbed will find it difficult to learn because of their high degree of emotional arousal, and their potential for school learning can be enhanced by alleviating their distress as much as or more than by increased teaching. For many years, experimental psychologists paid little systematic attention to feelings, assuming that useful explanations of human behavior were more likely to be found elsewhere. Indeed, we do sometimes speak as though feelings get in the way, or complain that they interfere with otherwise rational behavior, and some psychologists seem to have assumed that feelings were more properly the province of clinicians, whose understanding of feelings is informed by personal qualities such as sensitivity and the ability to empathize, as well as by their knowledge of the more scientific aspects of psychology. This view, however, gives insufficient weight to the evolutionary functions of motivation and emotion. Fear organizes us for flight, anger for attack. Of course, feelings such as anger can get us into as well as out of trouble, but without them we might put ourselves at risk, and we also depend on them for defining goals and organizing ourselves to work towards them. It has been argued that there is such a thing as emotional intelligence, a quality that varies between people and that can be more or less successfully employed to help us achieve our aims. Definitions of emotional intelligence are varied, placing more or less emphasis on self-awareness and on perceptiveness about others, and it is unclear whether it represents a predetermined personality trait or an ability that can be acquired. The hypothesis that a higher level of emotional intelligence will contribute to better social adjustment and to positive mental health does not have unambiguous support. In summary, the study of motivation and emotion has contributed to clinical fields as widely diverse as those of psychoanalysis and humanistic or cognitive behavioral therapies, and to the development of programs for those who need help with the regulation of eating, drinking, and sexual behaviors, and with addictive behaviors such as smoking and gambling. It has contributed because, in order to study feelings and to answer questions about why we do what we do, it has proved necessary to think in terms of many interacting systems: physical, cognitive, affective, behavioral, and socio-cultural. The complexity of doing this means that there is still much to learn. Our increased understanding of the interactions between emotional arousal and the capacity to attend, learn, and remember has had some practical uses. For example, in the UK the courts do not currently accept evidence collected using lie detectors, which only measure one component of emotion and therefore cannot be reliable. The complexity of the field may explain why there is still debate about such important issues as the effects of watching scenes of violence on television and the question of whether it is better to bottle up anger or to express it. Chapter 6. Is there a set pattern? Developmental psychology. The most obvious way that people develop is physical, transforming from tiny, helpless babies into more or less capable adults. Of course, we go on changing throughout our lives, but here we focus predominantly on early development, on changes that lead to maturation. Psychological studies in this area have revealed typical patterns of development, and their findings are used to predict the effects of early experience on later behavior, to advise parents about what to expect at different ages, to ascertain when development is not progressing as it should, and to plan appropriate opportunities to maximize developmental potential. Developmental psychology is concerned with understanding both what changes occur with age, and how those changes take place, the process of development. Two questions are particularly important in looking at the process of development. First, does development take place in stages, or is the process more continuous, or more variable than that? And, second, is development biologically determined by nature or influenced by environmental circumstances? The concept of stages suggests that everyone passes through the same stages in the same order, reaching the later ones only by going through earlier ones. It clearly is necessary to acquire basic before complex skills, and rough stages of development are reflected in the terms baby, child, and adult. But are there also finer stages? If so, how flexible are they? Observation suggests that development is not as fixed as the idea of stages suggests. Most children crawl before they can walk, but some do not. Exceptions to expected patterns of development prompted developmental psychologists to propose that there are critical periods in human development, that is, time periods during which events must occur, or not occur, for development to proceed normally. For example, if a human fetus does not receive the correct hormones before the 7th week of gestation, a genetic male may fail to develop male sexual organs until puberty triggers another bout of hormonal activity. By this time, they may have already developed a female identity and find it difficult to adjust to a male one. Similarly, it is easier to learn a second language fluently, without an accent, as a child than it is as an adult, and case studies of feral children, raised without exposure to language, suggest that children who have not started to learn a language by about the age of May 7 struggle to learn it at all. The relative importance of genetic and environmental factors, the nature-nurture question, is especially relevant to developmental psychology. Similarities in the characteristics of genetically identical twins reared apart suggest strong genetic influences on development. However, it is clear that the environment also influences development. The potential to learn a spoken language may be inborn, but the specific language learned is determined by the person's environment. Indeed, the environment, including social and cultural norms, may influence not only whether it is English or Chinese that is learnt in the accent with which it is spoken, but also the rate of language learning. Just to complicate things further, there are interactions between genes and the environment. Babies born with happy dispositions may elicit more positive responses from caregivers, thereby influencing their environment, which in turn exerts further influence on their temperamental development. Happy, smiley children elicit more positive responses from caregivers and thus become more happy and smiley. What is inborn? As mentioned in Chapter 3, babies are born predisposed to learn. They are born with useful reflexes such as sucking and grasping, and by 1 month, babies can discriminate sounds in order to gain a sweet taste. In all species, the young appear to be primed to learn skills that are useful, and human babies may be set up with abilities that encourage caregiving from adults. For example, newborn babies' exceptional ability to discriminate speech sounds allows them to recognize and show a preference for their mother's voice by the time they are 3 days old. It is even possible that some learning takes place in the womb. Newborn babies respond differently to their mother's language than to other languages. However, an innate potential may guide and facilitate subsequent learning. The experiment in Box 16 suggests that babies are born able to organize and interpret the flood of sensory stimuli they experience, as if they were already using some elementary perceptual principles. Similarly, recent research suggests that babies may not be as innocent as they appear. It was thought that children did not understand that other people could hold a different viewpoint, and thus that children did not develop the ability to deceive until the age of 3 or 4 years old. However, more recent studies show that children as young as 15 months can have some understanding of false beliefs, and that even 6-month-old babies may use this strategically by engaging in fake crying to gain attention. And their deceit becomes more sophisticated with age. By 8 months they may attempt to conceal forbidden activities or to distract a parent from seeing them. There is also evidence that babies may have some understanding of social dominance and hierarchy by as young as 10 months. They look for longer when a big person concedes to a smaller person than vice versa. And toddlers more often attempt to take a toy from a child smaller than themselves than from a bigger child. Box 16. What do babies know about numbers? Some 6-8-month-old babies were shown a series of pairs of slides, one showing 3 and the other showing 2 objects. At the same time as the babies were seeing a pair of slides, a speaker played either 2 or 3 drum beats. The babies tended to look longer at the slide that matched the number of drum beats. So when there were 2 drum beats, the babies spent more time looking at the slide with 2 objects. These results suggested that babies can abstract numerical information sufficiently well to recognize similarity or to match like with like. Similar experiments with 9-month-olds have suggested that babies show more surprise when sums don't add up. For example, when 2 lots of 5 objects go behind a box but only 1 lot is still there when the box is lifted. It is not suggested that they have specific knowledge about numbers, or about adding and subtracting, but rather that they have some innate ability that helps them to learn about these. Starkey, Spelk, and Gelman and McCrink and Wynne. Brain development. More developmental changes occur in the first few years of life than in any other time period. By the age of 2 you will be approximately half your adult height and your brain will be 80% of its adult size. You will also be able to walk and feed yourself, and use language to communicate basic needs. However, the brain continues to develop both in structure and function for far longer. Although it reaches its maximum weight by the age of 19, 21 it continues to develop for several more years. For example, one of the last regions to become fully formed, around the age of 25, is the region that inhibits risky behavior. Brain imaging studies suggest that motivation and reward circuitry in adolescent brains make them more prone to risk-taking behaviors such as substance abuse and unsafe sex, and more vulnerable to addictions and poor impulse control. As well as changes in structure, the neural pathways in the brain change with age. A 3-year-old's brain has about twice as many neural connections as an adult brain, and during adolescence a process of pruning starts, with those connections that are unnecessary or inefficient being lost. During adolescence, the amount of myelin also increases, improving the nerve cell's ability to conduct electrical signals and to function efficiently. This too continues into adulthood and occurs later in higher regions of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex. Personality and social development. 2-month-old babies of different cultures, and even blind babies, smile at their caregivers, an action that is likely to strengthen the bond between them, although initially it could be reflexive rather than communicative. The universality of smiling suggests that maturation may be important in determining its onset. Then, by 3 or 4 months, babies recognize and prefer familiar people although they remain friendly towards strangers until about 8 to 12 months old, when a fear of strangers develops. Both distress on separation and fear of strangers decrease by the age of 2 or 3, when children are more able to take care of some of their own needs. These changes make evolutionary sense. The fear of strangers increases with mobility and then decreases with increasing capability. It has been suggested that the child's bond with its primary caregiver is crucial in determining later psychological development. Mother love in infancy and childhood is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health. This bond is often referred to as an attachment, that is, a relatively enduring emotional tie to a specific person. An interesting hypothesis suggests that if this primary attachment relationship is not adequate, then serious psychiatric disorder may follow in adulthood. Secure attachments may enable children to feel secure in exploring new settings, gradually increasing their independence and detachment from the attachment figure. Attachment can be measured by how much the child seeks to be near the attachment figure, and is generally oriented towards them, becoming upset when they leave and happy when they return. Developmental psychologists have classified the quality of 12, 18-month-old children's attachments by observing their behavior in a structured setting, called the strange situation, in which a child and its caregiver are in a room full of toys. After some time, they are joined by someone who is a stranger to the child, then the caregiver leaves and returns a short while later. The child's behavior is observed at all stages through a one-way mirror. The child's responses to the caregiver leaving and returning, and to the presence of the stranger are used to classify the child's attachment style, the main categories being secure, avoidant, or resistant ambivalent. Securely attached children are able to use their caregiver's presence as a safe base for exploration and protest at their departure. They can be somewhat comforted by the stranger but are clearly more attached to the caregiver and immediately seek and gain comfort from them on their return. In contrast, children showing a more avoidant attachment pattern treat the stranger and the caregiver similarly. They are little affected by the caregiver leaving and are as easily comforted by the stranger as the caregiver. An ambivalent resistant attachment pattern is characterized by the child having difficulty in using the caregiver as a safe base for exploration, and showing distress on separation but ambivalence or anger on the caregiver's return. These children also resist the stranger's attempts to comfort them and appear preoccupied with the caregiver's availability. Theories about attachment have provided a rich source of hypotheses for subsequent research, for example on attachment behaviors, on the behavior of caregivers, whether male or female, and on possible links between attachment history and responses to events and experiences later in life. Although initially it was thought that attachment behavior was a form of cupboard love, that children became attached to their caregivers primarily because they were the main source of food, experiments with monkeys such as the one in Box 17 suggest that this is not the case. Box 17 is attachment just cupboard love? Infant monkeys were separated from their mothers shortly after birth and were given 2 substitute mothers. Both substitute mothers were made from wire mesh with wooden heads. One was covered with foam padding and terry cloth, which made it more cuddly. The other was bare wire but dispensed milk from a bottle attached to its chest. The monkeys showed much more attachment to the cuddly mother in spite of the fact that it was the wire mother that gave them milk. Harlow. In humans, it seems that the most important factors influencing attachment are the child's temperament and the attachment figure's responsiveness, understanding of and sensitivity to the child's needs. The attachment figures of insecurely attached babies tend to respond more on the basis of their own needs than to the baby's signals. For example, they play with the baby when it is convenient for them rather than when the baby shows signs of wanting to play. This may explain why a child's strongest attachment is not necessarily to the person who does most of the physical caretaking. The quality of care may be more important than the quantity in determining the particular style of attachments. 12. Attachment in monkeys. Effects of early experience. An important enterprise for developmental psychology has been to try to determine whether early experiences such as deprivation or attachment history affect later development, and if the effects can be ameliorated. The experiments in Box 18 attempt to investigate this issue. Box 18 investigating the effects of early deprivation and abuse. In the 1960s, psychologist Harry Harlow and colleagues carried out a series of studies investigating the effects of early deprivation and abuse on monkeys. They found that depriving monkeys of social interaction from birth, by raising them where they can see but not touch other monkeys, led to highly maladaptive behavior. Monkeys raised in such conditions were socially withdrawn and aggressive to their peers, they had difficulty mating, and often subsequently became abusive to their own offspring. However, if the monkeys were reintegrated by 3 months, or if they were given even one playmate, they could develop normally. Other experiments involved raising monkeys with abusive mothers, which were cloth monkeys that blasted the infants with cold air. These studies found that the abused baby monkeys showed stronger attachments to their mothers than non-abused monkeys. Although it would be unethical to carry out such experiments with human babies, it is possible to study individual case studies of extreme deprivation or abuse, and children who spend significant amounts of time in institutions. Such studies show that the effects of deprivation in childhood are not clear-cut. There is much evidence that children raised in extremely poor environments, such as institutions with low staff ratios and high turnover, or with animals, are severely disadvantaged in terms of their physical, cognitive, and social development. Yet there are also studies, such as those on children from Romanian orphanages adopted by English families before the age of 2, which show remarkable catch-up of abilities by the age of 4. The catch-up effect was strongest for the children who were adopted earlier. However, early deprivation also appeared to have a long-term impact as the children tended to form disinhibited attachments, showing indiscriminate friendliness to any adult. Cases of extreme neglect have also been used to help understand the reversibility of early deprivation. Jeannie spent most of her first 13 years alone, tightly bound, and being beaten for making any sound. When she was discovered, Jeannie could neither chew nor walk upright, was incontinent, and understood little language. She was given intensive rehabilitation and eventually placed in a foster home where she made amazing progress in developing both physical and social skills. However, although she learned to understand and use basic language, her grammar and pronunciation remained abnormal, and her progress deteriorated when she later returned to institutional care. In contrast, Kolachova describes the case of 7-year-old twin boys who were discovered in similarly extreme conditions but who did seem to make a remarkable recovery, and were able to live normal adult lives after being placed in an exceptionally caring foster family. The differences in outcome may be due to a combination of risk and rescue factors such as inherent resilience, the availability of one caring person, the age at rescue, and the quality of rehabilitative care. Many studies show that the harmful effects of early experiences can be ameliorated, at least somewhat, particularly if the child is still young when the conditions are improved. However, it is difficult to draw conclusions from such studies as of course there are no directly comparable control groups and it is not usually known whether those who ended up in deprived environments had any disabilities prior to these experiences. Research also shows that later experiences have an impact on the relationship between early experiences and later outcomes. Children raised in care ended up with much better functioning if they had positive school experiences and marriages. Such research has led to changes in the recommended ways that children are cared for in institutions, and in greater use of family foster care for children who cannot be cared for in their families of origin. Similarly, findings showing multiple attachments, and that the primary attachment does not have to be to the mother, have helped to resolve concerns about children raised in non-stereotypical families, e.g. by same-sex parents. Development over the lifespan. Although this chapter has focused on early development, people continue to develop physically and psychologically throughout their lives. Whilst changes such as puberty are at least partly due to physical maturation, others reflect a substantial degree of environmental influence, such as adopting a more sedentary lifestyle with increasing age and retirement. Several developmental psychologists have proposed theories outlining the developmental stages across the lifespan, and Table 1 outlines one of these. Ericsson's theory suggests that there are definite stages, each involving a specific dilemma or psychosocial crisis, that everyone progresses through during a lifetime. However, subsequent research has suggested that the stages might not be as fixed as was initially thought, with, for example, some adolescents having a strong sense of identity. In later life, the focus for developmental psychology has been on cognitive functioning. Initially, studies comparing intelligence test scores in groups of older and younger people showed that younger people had higher IQs, suggesting that intelligence declined with age. However, these studies failed to take account of the cohort effect, social determinants of performance on IQ tests, and the fact that intelligence scores of the whole population had increased with better education and nutrition. When intelligence was measured repeatedly in the same people, there was no evidence that it declined with age. Rather, it increased slightly for those who continued to use their minds. Similarly, the supposed deterioration of memory with age does not stand up well to scientific investigation but suggests that the system responds to the demands you make of it. Comparisons of memory for everyday events show that older people perform slightly better than younger ones, possibly because they are more concerned about their memories and are more attentive and motivated during testing. The belief that memory declines with increasing age was described as a myth in 2012, as it appears to be partly due to a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people expect to become more forgetful, they try less hard and notice forgetting more than remembering. Younger people are altogether less bothered by signs of forgetfulness. It appears that as long as people continue to keep physically, mentally, and socially active, they need not expect a noticeable decline in their mental abilities until very late in life. Indeed, the knowledge they have accumulated may help them to do better than younger people in some respects, although they are still likely to have trouble remembering names and appointments. Table 1 Ericsson's stages of development. Stage. Main task or challenge associated with the stage: early infancy. Trust versus mistrust. Trusting and risking disappointment versus being mistrustful and not relating fully to others. This balance is affected by both the child's disposition and the quality of caregiving. Later infancy. Autonomy versus shame. Developing a sense of autonomy and personal responsibility versus the sense of shame arising from doubt about one's abilities. Early childhood. Initiative versus guilt. Increased personal responsibility for and initiative in making one's own choices versus guilt about those choices. Middle childhood. Industry versus inferiority. Learning to exert effort to overcome challenges and developing competence, with reference to others and to perceived norms versus fearing challenge and feeling inadequate or a failure. Adolescence. Identity versus role confusion. Establishing a consistent sense of identity through exploration of different roles versus confusion from overwhelming opportunities and failure to develop an integrated self-image. Young. Intimacy versus isolation. Exploring romantic and other. Adulthood. Attachments to experience love and commitment versus fearing relationships and risking isolation and loneliness. Mature adulthood. Generativity versus stagnation. Developing productivity in contributing to family and society versus stagnation and feelings of uselessness. Late adulthood. Ego integrity versus despair. Being able to look back at one's life with a sense of integrity and accomplishment versus looking back with a sense of despair. Many biological, social, and environmental factors influence developmental processes. Although there is a rough pattern for development, and self-righting tendencies stimulate constant adaptation, there are also many potential pitfalls. The process is clearly a complex one, so differences between age groups could result from changes over the generations rather than from aging itself, and in adulthood the differences within age groups are usually far greater than those between them. Nevertheless, developmental psychologists can make predictions about which factors will affect development adversely and which will not, in fields as diverse as moral development, language acquisition, and the development of thinking and gender identity. The challenges for developmental psychologists are to find ways of ameliorating the effects of negative early experiences, finding remedies for when development is not proceeding normally, and to explore ways of enhancing adjustment throughout the lifespan. Chapter 7. Can we categorize people? Individual differences. While the previous chapter looked at typical developmental processes and patterns, emphasizing the similarities between people, this chapter is concerned with differences between people. Most of us prefer to think of ourselves as unique, but is it possible to categorize the differences between us, and to identify the determinants of such differences? On the practical side, psychologists have developed ways of measuring people so as to find out more about the similarities and differences between them. These psychological assessments often take the form of paper and pencil measures, such as aptitude or achievement tests, to measure abilities or accomplishments, or to assess suitability for particular educational or occupational positions. Psychological measurement. Psychological tests or psychometric instruments need to be both reliable and valid, that is, they should consistently measure the variable that they claim to measure. For example, a test of reading ability would not be considered a good test if it gave the same person very different scores when tested a few days apart, or if a person who could not read well scored highly on it. To be useful, psychological tests must also be standardized, which means that there must be an established set of norms against which to compare individual scores. Standardizing tests involves giving the test to a large group of the type of people it is intended for, and using statistics to calculate norms, to work out what is an average score, and what proportion of the population score different amounts above or below this average. These norms can then be used to interpret an individual's test. Score. For instance, IQ tests are scored so that the population's average score is 100, and 95% of the population score between 70 and 130, so someone scoring 132 can be judged to be well above average. Psychologists have also found that the way in which a test is administered and the conditions of testing can influence the results. If the lighting is poor, or the person does not hear or understand the instructions, then their score may be artificially low. Thus, the conditions under which the test is administered must also be standardized. As far as possible, the test must be given to each person in exactly the same way, under similar conditions, if the results are to be valid. Psychometric tests are used to assess a wide variety of abilities and attributes, and this chapter focuses on the two facets of individual differences that have been most intensively studied and measured: intelligence and personality. As in other areas of psychology, there has been much debate about whether individual differences in intelligence and personality are the results of inherited or environmental influences. Intelligence. Despite being one of the most important concepts in psychology, intelligence is one of the most elusive to define. Intelligence can simply be viewed as the ability to respond adaptively to one's environment, but this ability may involve many aspects, such as being able to think logically, rationally, and abstractly, as well as the ability to be creative and to learn, and to apply this learning in new situations. Psychologists have questioned whether intelligence is a common thread underlying all mental processes or whether it reflects several different more or less closely related factors. There are correlations between different types of intelligence, but the abilities of idiot savants, people with low IQs but with one extraordinary ability, such as being able to name the day of the week of any date in the last 10 years, suggest that people can have vastly different abilities in different areas. Furthermore, a question of great practical interest has been whether intelligence is predetermined, or whether it can be learnt or enhanced. Intelligence tests. One of the simplest definitions of intelligence is to define it as what IQ tests measure, a circular definition that raises issues concerning the relationship between IQ tests and definitions of intelligence. The way in which intelligence is defined influences the tests that are designed to measure it. For example, a two-factor model supposes that intelligence is made up of a general factor and specific factors, whereas other models suggest that there are a number of independent specific factors such as numerical reasoning, memory, musical ability, word fluency, visuospatial ability, perceptual speed, insight into oneself, and understanding of others, but no single general factor. Another approach has been to examine the processes involved in intelligence, such as the speed of processing, how information is represented internally, or the strategies used to solve problems. Lack of agreement over the definition of intelligence makes it difficult to construct tools to measure it. Any intelligence test is based on a particular definition or conceptualization of intelligence and thus reflects the biases of that conceptualization. For example, time tests place more emphasis on the speed of processing, whereas other tests may be designed to measure separate specific factors or a general ability. Box 19 gives some examples of the items used in intelligence tests. Box 19. What intelligence tests ask? Most intelligence tests contain several subscales, consisting of different types of questions. Some may simply ask for information with questions such as, how many months are there in a year? Other subscales may assess the person's memory by asking them to repeat increasingly long strings of numbers forwards or backwards. Or assess their arithmetic by asking questions like, raffle tickets cost 76 pence each. If I bought 6 tickets, how much change would I get from £10? Vocabulary or comprehension may be assessed by asking for definitions of common words, or by asking what the similarity is between word pairs such as orange banana or reward punishment. You would need to say that they were both a means of influencing the behavior of others to get the maximum points. Other subscales may involve arranging pictures in the best order so they tell a story, or may be more practical such as arranging blocks to copy a design or doing jigsaw-like puzzles. Intelligence tests usually give a score expressed as an intelligence quotient or IQ. As mental ability increases during the first 18 years of life, the raw test scores must be adjusted in the light of the person's chronological age. This is done with reference to norms for the person's age group. For children, scores are sometimes expressed as a mental age. Thus a particularly bright 7-year-old child, who performs as well as the average 10-year-old, could be said to have a chronological age of 7 but a mental age of 10. Intelligence tests have been criticized on many grounds. A fundamental difficulty is that they do not measure intelligence itself, but attempt to measure the qualities that are thought to reflect it. They have been validated primarily in terms of educational achievement, which may be less of a product of intelligence and more a product of other factors such as social class, opportunity, and motivation. Furthermore, IQ test scores have been shown to be affected by temporary situational factors such as motivation and emotional state, and can be increased by practice, which casts doubt on how truly they measure intelligence. A particularly controversial finding is that Black Americans scored significantly lower than white Americans on standard intelligence tests. Originally the gap was 15 points, but this had narrowed to half that by the late 1980s. Indeed, most ethnic groups score lower than white middle-class groups on IQ tests. This finding has been interpreted by some as evidence of the intellectual superiority of some races over others, but other observations, such as the finding that German babies fathered by Black and white American soldiers have similar IQs, suggest that the difference in IQ scores is unlikely to be due to genetic inferiority-superiority. Similar differences in IQ scores are also found in relation to a child's parental income. It is much more likely that such differences between races and social classes reflect a deficit in standard IQ tests. They are biased in favor of the dominant culture. Indeed, the whole concept of a test is culture-bound and likely to advantage cultures with school-based systems of education where tests are commonplace. There have been attempts to construct culture-fair tests, which do not ask for culturally biased information and often don't use language at all. However, it has proved almost impossible to be fair to more than one culture at a time, as the concepts being tested are rarely culture-free, even in nonverbal tests. For example, some cultures would group an orange with a knife and a fish with a hook, whereas others would group tools and food. One suggestion that reconciles some of the disagreement about what intelligence is, and whether it is inborn, is that there are two basic types of intelligence, one that reflects a genetic potential or an inborn basic ability, and another that is acquired or learnt as experience interacts with potential. In 1963, Cattell suggested that fluid intelligence is the inborn ability to solve abstract problems, whereas crystallized intelligence involves practical problem solving and knowledge, which comes from experience. 13. You can't build a hut, you don't know how to find edible roots, and you know nothing about predicting the weather. In other words, you do terribly on our IQ test. 14. Culture-fair intelligence test questions. The participant is asked to choose which of the 4 items on the right best fits the pattern on the left. Is intelligence influenced by the environment? Many studies show that those with the closest genetic relationship are also most similar in IQ scores, suggesting a strong genetic component to IQ. However, as genetic similarity between people increases, so does similarity in their environments. One way of overcoming this is to study identical twins who have been reared apart, comparing them with identical twins reared together. Those reared together have closer IQ scores, suggesting a role for the environment, and this is corroborated by studies of adopted children showing that their IQs are closer to those of their adoptive than biological parents. There is clearly a strong genetic influence as well, as the IQs of identical twins reared apart are still more similar than those of non-identical same-sex twins reared together. But, hardly surprisingly, it is not easy to separate the two types of influence. For instance, separated twins shared the same environment in utero, and the environment of an adopted child may intentionally be matched with that of its mother. The mother's IQ may contribute to the child's IQ in 2 ways, directly, through genetics, and indirectly, as her behavior is one of the main determinants of the child's environment. Can intelligence be increased? A question that is of greater practical use is whether intelligence can be enhanced by environmental influences. Even minimal interventions such as giving high-quality nutritional supplements to children in developing countries can enhance IQ scores, possibly through their effect on general health and, thus, on factors such as energy, concentration, and attention. There is also evidence showing that the amount of parental attention a child receives affects its IQ. This may explain why firstborn children have slightly higher IQs than their siblings, because the first child usually gets more attention. Many studies have investigated whether various brain training programs can enhance IQ, and although they do enhance performance on certain tasks, there is little evidence that this effect generalizes to other tasks or persists once the training is discontinued. So it seems more of a practice effect than any real enhancement of intelligence. More practically focused studies have attempted to use educational programs to help disadvantaged children. An example is provided in Box 20. What can be concluded from these studies on intelligence and IQ? It seems likely that intelligence, which is still hard to define and to measure, is too complex a construct to be reflected in a single number such as an IQ score. On the practical side, studies of intelligence have shown that both genetic and environmental influences are important, and that it is possible to manipulate environmental circumstances to produce enduring benefits, both in terms of IQ and achievement. Personality. As a concept, personality is possibly even more central in psychology, and even more difficult to define, than intelligence. Loosely speaking, personality reflects a characteristic set of behaviors, attitudes, interests, motives, and feelings about the world. It includes the way in which people relate to others and is thought to be relatively stable throughout life. One reason for identifying and measuring the ways in which personalities differ is to be able to predict future behavior, so as to anticipate or modify it. However, measuring personality suffers from similar difficulties to those inherent in measuring intelligence because, like intelligence, there is no clear agreement about what personality is and it cannot be measured directly, it can only be inferred from the behaviors that are thought to reflect it. Box 20 Head Start Program. The Head Start program, started in the USA in 1965 as an 8-week summer school, aimed to enhance the social and cognitive development of preschool children through the provision of education, health, nutrition, and other social care services. Daycare centers operating throughout the school year were then set up specifically for the most disadvantaged children. Over 30 million children have participated in these programs, and several attempts have been made to evaluate their impact. Results are mixed, but one consistent finding is that the programs must be comprehensive and of significant duration. A few weeks of summer school is not sufficient to mitigate the effects of years of poverty. Some studies show that children who participate in Head Start score higher on IQ tests than comparable children, but the difference tends to fade with time following the end of the program, particularly for those who go on to poorer quality schools. Those who start the program earlier show more benefit for longer than those who start later. There is also some evidence of a broader range of benefits from Head Start than just enhancing IQ, such as being more likely to complete school, attend college, have higher earnings in their mid-20s, and being less likely to be involved in criminal activity or suffer from poor health as an adult. Several theories of personality have been proposed and the main approaches are summarized in Table 2. Table 2 The main approaches to theories of personality. Approach. View of personality. Categorical. People are fitted into broad categories, with each type being type. Qualitatively different from others, e.g. type A or B, introvert or extrovert. Trait. A descriptive approach in which people are defined according to how much of each of a list of traits they have, e.g. high conscientiousness, low introversion. Behaviorist views personality as merely a reflection of the person's learning history. They repeat the responses that have been reinforced in the past. Cognitive. Beliefs, thoughts, and mental processes are seen as primary in determining behavior across situations. Psychodynamic. Based on Freud's theory, personality is understood to be determined by intrapsychic structures, and by unconscious motives or conflicts from early childhood. Individual. Emphasizes higher human motives and views personality as the individual's complete experience rather than as having separate parts. Situational. Suggests that personality is not consistent but is merely a response to the situation. We learn to behave in ways that are appropriate to the situation through reinforcement. Interactive. Combines the situational and trait approaches, so suggests that people have a tendency to behave in certain ways but that this is moderated by the demands of different situations. Each of the different approaches in Table 2 reflects a comprehensive theory and it is not possible to cover them in depth here. Instead, we will highlight some of the main ways in which they differ, and we will use Eysenk's theory of personality, which combines elements of both the type and trait approaches, as an example. Different theories of personality vary in the degree to which they see behaviors as determined by the individual or by the situations they are in, and in general, we tend to overestimate the importance of personality in explaining another's behavior. However, the situational and behavioral approaches may go too far when they suggest that all variation in behavior is determined by situational factors or conditioned by patterns of reinforcement. If the situation or reinforcement contingencies accounted for everything, then we would all behave identically in the same situation, which is clearly not so. Indeed, the situation may be influenced by internal events. Different people may see the same situations differently. If an acquaintance walks past someone without speaking, one person will see this as being ignored by an acquaintance, whereas another will be thinking, "He didn't notice me." Similarly, the nuance of the situation is important. A generally shy person may in fact be quite comfortable with public speaking. So traits may not be consistent across all situations. Thus, most contemporary theories suggest that both situational and individual factors contribute to those relatively enduring and stable characteristics that we call personality. Approaches to personality also vary in the degree to which they see people as types or as having more or less of certain traits. Type theories tend to emphasize the similarities between people, whereas trait approaches stress the differences between individuals and their inherent uniqueness. Eysenck's approach combines both. He used complex statistical techniques to analyze and group together the hundreds of traits shown by large numbers of people. Initially, he came up with 2 dimensions: introversion, extroversion, and stability, neuroticism, with the majority of people scoring in the middle of the dimensions. Each dimension is made up of a number of traits, and someone who is high on one trait is thought likely to be high on the other traits in that dimension, giving an overall type. Eysenck's theory of personality is illustrated in Figure 15. 15. Eysenck's personality types. Eysenck proposed a biological basis to his theory, suggesting that these personality dimensions were related to differences in brain functioning. He suggested that extroverts have lower arousal levels and thus seek more stimulation and excitement than introverts. Twin studies have suggested a genetic component to introversion, extroversion, and recent research into how the brain works has found some possible neural correlates. For example, extroversion has been linked to the network of brain systems controlling sensitivity to reward and generating approach behavior. This may explain why extroversion is correlated with happiness, since those high in extroversion will more easily feel the excitement of a potential reward. Similarly, extroversion is associated with enhanced allocation of attention in response to social stimuli, suggesting these may be more motivating for extroverts. In contrast, introverts' emotional centers in the brain are more easily activated by emotional stimuli, and introverts have more blood flow in the frontal lobes of their brain and in areas that deal with internal processes, such as planning and problem solving. The discovery of neural correlates of personality suggests it has a biological basis, and that individual differences in personality are related to meaningful individual differences in brain structures and responses to social stimuli. A psychological test has been developed to measure the dimensions of Eysenck's theory, and it uses questions such as, "Do you like talking to people so much that you never miss the opportunity to talk to a stranger?" and "Can you easily get some life into a dull party?" to indicate extroversion. Answering yes to questions such as, "Do you often worry about things you shouldn't have done or said?" and "Are you troubled by feelings of inferiority?" is taken to indicate greater neuroticism. Although many people view introversion and extroversion as categories, they actually reflect a single continuous dimension of personality on which a few score near either end and most fall in the middle. Ambiversion is the term used to describe those in the middle of the introversion-extroversion continuum who show some traits of both characteristics. What use are tests of intelligence and personality? Scores on psychological tests measuring personality and intelligence supposedly help us to make predictions about behavior and achievement. But the evidence suggests that neither personality nor intelligence is as fixed as the concept of psychometric testing suggests. There is evidence that some personality traits remain relatively stable over time, particularly after adolescence and early adulthood, but it is less clear that scores measuring them predict someone's actual behavior in a given situation. This consistency paradox reflects the fact that we tend to see other people as being relatively consistent, as in, John is the outgoing type, despite being unable to predict their actual behavior at any one time. Examining behavior across a range of situations shows that personality traits are more predictable at the general level but not so well in a single situation, as so many variables are involved, externally and internally, such as mood and fatigue. There has also been much interest in whether IQ predicts behavior. While there is a relationship between IQ and aspects of intelligent behavior such as job performance, it is not a strong relationship, and within most occupations there is a wide range of IQs. In fact, some studies suggest that socioeconomic background is a better predictor of future academic and occupational success than IQ. A long-term study of children with very high IQs found that some became very successful adults but others did not, with no differences in IQ between the two groups. There were, however, great differences in motivation. The more successful individuals had much more ambition and drive to succeed. Although psychologists have made significant advances in quantifying and measuring the differences between people, some caution is needed in using such information. In interpreting any single test score, it is vital to remember that many factors may have influenced it, including genetic potential, experience, motivation, and conditions of testing. Thus, single scores such as those provided by an IQ test cannot be seen as defining the limit of a person's ability, rather they should be viewed as an indication of their current level or the approximate range within which they would generally fall. Other dangers associated with psychometric testing arise from value judgments about certain scores. For example, it may be implied that higher scores are better and that people who achieve them are superior. In its most extreme form, this argument can be used for social and political purposes to support ideas such as eugenics, which aims to improve the genetic composition of a population by promoting increased reproduction of more desired people traits and reduced reproduction of less desired people traits. But generally speaking, knowing more about how to measure the ways in which people differ according to dimensions such as intelligence and personality has helped us to understand more about the number of contributing variables, the potential for change, and the relationship to achievement and happiness. Chapter 8. What happens when things go wrong? Abnormal psychology. Abnormal psychology is concerned with behavior that is atypical or dysfunctional, and with mental disorder or disability. However, it is through understanding the processes involved in normal functioning that we can understand what happens when they go wrong. The study of illusions has revealed the degree to which, normally, we actively construct our notions of reality, and the enormous amount of brain activity that remains out of awareness. Yet we assume that we can know the real world and are not just hallucinating. How do we know? Why do we suppose that reality is normal and hallucinations are not, given that our knowledge of reality is the product of constructive processes, and therefore could itself be called illusory? How do we decide what is abnormal? Extreme forms of psychological abnormality are easy to recognize, but the point at which normality becomes abnormality is much less clear. For example, it is normal to feel sad after a bereavement, but the lines between normal and abnormal grief, and between grief and clinical depression, are not so clear. It would be abnormal to keep every receipt you have ever been given, to the point where there is room for little else in your home. But is it also abnormal to keep most receipts for a year or two, just in case? Most people consider it normal to have occasional irrational fears. For example, of heights or of public speaking, but what if the fear is severe enough to prevent you driving over bridges or doing your job? Our ideas about normality come from noticing the unusual or abnormal in the present, but they are also influenced by what happened in the past and by our sense of acceptability, by historical and cultural factors. Think about changes in opinion about homosexuality, about its legal and psychiatric status, and arguments about parenting by two people of the same gender. There are many ways of conceptualizing abnormality. Psychological ways emphasize personal distress and interference, if personal suffering is involved, or if the condition prevents someone achieving important goals, it is seen as dysfunctional and worthy of intervention. However, with this approach we struggle to account for people who lack insight into their difficulties, such as those with delusions of grandeur who are not distressed by believing that they are God, or those with anorexia who may view the advantages of being seriously underweight as outweighing the serious health risks. Similarly, defining behavior as abnormal solely on the grounds that it causes great distress may be problematic, the behavior itself may be normal and it may be only the degree of distress that is abnormal. Medical conceptualizations suggest abnormality is a symptom of an underlying disease, the cause of which may be genetic, or may involve structural or chemical abnormalities in the brain. This medical model has been criticized for ignoring the effects of the person's environment and social context, and for undermining personal responsibility, for example when people rely on a doctor for a cure. Its validity has also been called into question because two people may have the same diagnosis, but different symptoms. Or they may not have enough symptoms to meet criteria for the diagnosis of a particular disease, but have one or two symptoms such as suspiciousness or social withdrawal at a severe level. Technically they do not have an illness, yet their behavior may appear strikingly abnormal. Abnormality has also been defined in terms of both statistical and social norms. So people are judged to have intellectual disability if their IQ is in the lowest 2.5% of the population. However, this approach confounds normality with desirability. Desirable behaviors or attributes may be statistically uncommon but not seen as abnormal, such as having an IQ in the top 2.5%. Furthermore, emotional problems such as depression or anxiety are sufficiently common to be statistically normal, and the context in which they occur helps to determine what would normally be expected. A degree of depression is a normal response to a relationship ending but not to winning the lottery. Behavior that deviates from what is typical for the social context may also be seen as abnormal. Although this approach takes the person's environment into account, it is dependent upon prevailing social, moral, and cultural attitudes, and thus relies on valued judgments about normality. Existential approaches suggest abnormal behavior is an inevitable response to an unpredictable world. Each person is responsible for defining their own normality, and disorder occurs when people feel compelled to conform to societal expectations instead of acting with authenticity in the pursuit of their own true values and goals. This can explain why someone's behavior may be more of a problem for those around them, or for society, than for themselves. Normalizing or health-based approaches attempt to specify normality or healthy psychological functioning and then define abnormality in contrast to this. Ideal mental health is thought to involve characteristics such as accurate perception of reality, some degree of self-knowledge and awareness of one's feelings and motives, autonomy and confidence in the ability to exert self-control, a sense of self-worth and self-acceptance. The ability to form close and satisfying relationships, and environmental mastery, being able to meet the varying demands of day-to-day situations. Clearly not everyone will meet this ideal all the time, and one difficulty for this approach is deciding how big a deviation has to be before it is considered to be abnormal. As none of the definitions above is completely satisfactory, it may be better to combine various elements of them, as shown in Box 21. Box 21 factors which may indicate that behavior is abnormal. None of these features is necessary or sufficient for behavior to be seen as abnormal, but they can indicate abnormality. Suffering, irrationality and incomprehensibility, unpredictability and loss of control, personal and social maladaptiveness, unconventionality, violation of moral or idealized standards, causing distress to others observing the behavior. This combined approach is flexible, but based on subjective judgments about which people may disagree. Part of the difficulty in defining abnormality is that each person's history as well as their current situation contributes to the way they think, feel, and act. And this should be taken into account. For instance, a particular behavior may have reflected an adaptive response in an earlier environment. A child who learns to avoid punishment or criticism by keeping quiet may be showing behavior that is functional in those circumstances. However, if the reticence persists into adulthood, then it may prevent that person forming close and confiding relationships. The process here may be normal and initially adaptive, but it may result later in behavior which is maladaptive, interfering with the ability to relate well to others, and causes distress. Classifying abnormality. There are advantages and disadvantages inherent in attempting to classify the different forms of abnormal behavior. One potential advantage is that, if different types of abnormality have different causes, then we may be able to understand more about the various syndromes by studying a number of people with a specific problem and looking for similarities, for instance in their history, behavior, or physiology. By studying many people who had panic attacks, it was noticed that they tended to interpret their bodily sensations during an attack as signs of impending catastrophe. Breathlessness was taken as a sign of impending suffocation. A pounding heart suggested imminent heart attack. Further research has shown that these catastrophic interpretations play a central role in panic attacks. Classifying and labeling different types of abnormal behavior into diagnoses, the medical names for disorders, conveys a wealth of information in relatively few words. For example, the agreed criteria for the definition tell us that people with anorexia overemphasize the importance of shape and weight and restrict their intake in order to become thinner. Information gathered from well-conducted research on the treatment of anorexia also helps to work out which treatments are likely to be effective. But when using diagnostic labels, it is important to avoid stereotyping. The danger is that once people are given a label, they may be seen as identical to other people with the same label when in fact the differences are as marked as the similarities. This can mean that important details about their problem and personal responses are ignored. It can also be dehumanizing when the person rather than the illness is labeled, as in, he's a schizophrenic rather than, he is suffering from schizophrenia, as if the person is defined by the illness and is not otherwise a person. Psychiatric diagnoses are made according to detailed classification systems such as those presented in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is produced by the American Psychiatric Association. Such systems, even though they are constantly being revised, are useful for research and for clinical purposes. They provide a shared language for understanding each disorder to people working in different places, so that they know that they are referring to the same thing. They also provide a clearly defined way of ascertaining whether the criteria for assigning a diagnosis are met. The main categories of abnormal behavior covered in DSM-4-TR are shown in Table 3. To meet the criteria for diagnosis according to the DSM, the person must have been experiencing a minimum number of the specified symptoms for a certain period of time, and those symptoms must cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. So these are not all or none definitions, and the different forms of abnormal behavior exist on a continuum with normal behavior. Thus, it is easy to recognize oneself in reading about abnormal behavior, and people may feel that they have every diagnosis in the book when they first read the details. Table 3: Different types of abnormal behavior. Category. Examples of specific disorders: schizophrenic and other psychotic disorders. A group of disorders characterized by symptoms of loss of contact with reality, as in hallucinations or delusions, marked disturbances of thought and perception, disorganized and bizarre behavior, and negative symptoms such as a lack of emotional response and low motivation. Anxiety disorders. Several disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, in which the main symptoms are of anxiety either in response to a particular stimulus, as in phobias, or more diffuse anxiety, as in generalized anxiety. Many anxiety disorders include the experience of panic attacks, defined in terms of the sudden and intense onset of anxiety symptoms. Mood disorders. Disturbances of normal mood ranging from extreme depression to abnormal elation, or alternating between the two. Somatoform disorders. Physical symptoms, such as pain or paralysis, for which no physical basis can be found, and in which psychological factors appear to play a role. Also included in this category are hypochondriasis, somatization disorder, and body dysmorphic disorder. Dissociative disruption in the usually integrated functions of disorders. Consciousness, memory, identity, or perception for emotional reasons. Included in this category are dissociative identity disorder, depersonalization disorder, and dissociative amnesia and fugue. Sexual and gender identity disorders. Sexual desire and sexual preference disorders such as sexual interest in children, or in objects, gender identity disorders such as transsexualism, and sexual arousal disorders. Eating disorders. Severe disturbances in eating behavior. Sleep disorders. Abnormalities in the amount, quality, or timing of sleep, or abnormal behavior or physiological events occurring during sleep. Impulse control disorders not elsewhere classified. Failure to resist an impulse, drive, or temptation that may harm oneself or others, e.g. kleptomania involving impulsive stealing for no personal gain, or trichotillomania involving habitual pulling out of one's hair, or pathological gambling. Personality disorders. Enduring patterns of inner experience and behavior that are pervasive and inflexible, lead to distress or impairment, and deviate from social norms, e.g. narcissistic personality disorder involves a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. Obsessive-compulsive personality is characterized by preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control. Substance-related. Substance use disorders, such as excessive use of or dependence on alcohol or drugs, and substance-induced disorders. Disorders where the use of substances leads to other symptoms such as psychosis or delirium. Factitious disorders. Symptoms that are intentionally produced or feigned in order to assume a sick role, to gain financial benefits or reduce responsibility. This is usually self-inflicted but can be acted out against someone else, usually a dependent child. Explaining abnormality and developing effective treatments. Historically, abnormalities have been attributed to a wide variety of causes, from dietary deficiencies to the phases of the moon or evil spirits. More recently, scientific methods such as careful observation and hypothesis testing have led to numerous theories. Not surprisingly, these explanations are quite closely related to the different views of personality that are outlined in Chapter 7. Explanations of abnormal behavior vary in the degree to which they focus on the past or present, whether they are based on psychological theory or medical models, and on whether the views of the therapist and patient are given equal weight. They also advocate different types of intervention or treatment. The medical model, which dominated psychiatry for many years, understood abnormal behavior to result from physical or mental illnesses caused by genetic, biochemical, or physical dysfunctions in the brain or body. One of the early successes of the medical model was the discovery that general paresis, a debilitating form of dementia that was common in the early 20th century, was a long-term consequence of infection with syphilis. As in other branches of medicine, the priority in practice is to establish the correct diagnosis. Treatment follows from this and is often a physical intervention aimed at altering brain functioning, such as medication, psychosurgery, or ECT. Both psychosurgery and ECT were widely and relatively indiscriminately used before the advent of drug therapies. They are now used mostly as a last resort when other treatments have failed and urgent intervention is needed. New treatments are still being developed. Research suggests that it may become possible to relieve treatment-resistant depression using highly specific methods of deep brain stimulation. Pharmacotherapy research continues to produce new drugs that have increasingly specific effects. However, so far these do not work for everyone, and relapse is common following discontinuation of medication. While modern psychoactive medications may not have the debilitating side effects of earlier ones, effects such as weight gain, joint stiffness, and, occasionally, increases in suicidality or aggression still occur. Psychodynamic approaches were based originally on the theories of Sigmund Freud and explain abnormality in terms of conflicts between instinctual drives, leading to anxieties. These conflicts are dealt with by defense mechanisms, or strategies used to avoid or reduce the experience of anxiety, and to protect the person's ego. Treatment often focuses on early life experiences and involves helping to reveal the patient's unconscious motives and to resolve the original conflicts. Psychodynamic therapists develop techniques such as free association, encouraging patients to say whatever comes into their minds, and then interpreting the associations in terms of psychodynamic theories. Humanistic psychotherapy focuses rather on the present, and views patients as being in the best position to understand their own problems. Each person's sense of self is seen as critical in promoting personal growth and well-being, and the aim of therapy is to promote self-esteem and self-acceptance. Therapists adopt an attitude of unconditional positive regard, that is, being genuinely non-judgmental, warm, accepting, and empathic attitudes subsequently widely recommended. Purely behavioral approaches explain psychological symptoms as maladaptive behavior patterns which were learnt and could thus be unlearnt. Initially they claimed that it was not necessary to understand the origins of abnormal behavior in order to treat it, and interventions focused entirely on the present, on observable behavior, internal events and meanings, and the patient's history were considered unimportant. Therapy techniques included reconditioning by, for example, systematic desensitization, in which relaxation techniques are used to reduce anxiety during exposure to a hierarchy of increasingly anxiety-provoking situations. More recently, behavioral approaches have been combined with cognitive approaches to form cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral approaches take into account history, current patterns of behavior, findings from experimental research in cognitive psychology and from research into clinical effectiveness, and above all cognition. Cognition includes thoughts, assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, expectations, and so on, reflections of all the ways in which someone makes sense of the past, present, and future, and which may be reflected in dreams and images as well as in behavior. Patients are encouraged to examine the cognitive processes by which they arrive at a particular state of mind, and to change these processes together with the behaviors that may reinforce them so as to feel better. In all the main psychotherapies, the precise intervention used depends on the patient's idiosyncratic formulation, i.e., on the way in which the theory is applied to the problems experienced by the patient in practice. The formulation is intended to provide a personalized understanding of relevant factors. Using an example from CBT, these would include past experiences, vulnerability to psychological disorder, precipitants of problems, and the factors maintaining the problem in the current environment. So someone bullied at school might develop beliefs about being unacceptable to others. Such beliefs leave them vulnerable to feeling inadequate or unlikable as adults, and when activated by environmental circumstances, these beliefs prompt maladaptive patterns of responding that maintain the problem. A cycle of maintenance might start with thoughts about being unlikable, leading to anxiety about social situations, and avoidance of social contact. Resulting isolation then confirms the belief in being unlikable. Interventions include re-evaluating the validity of thoughts and testing these out in the patient's current circumstances using a combination of cognitive and behavioral methods. These are described in an introductory book by Westbrook. See Figure 16. This method can also be applied to issues arising from the past and reflected in current beliefs. Recent research has shown that children who have been bullied between the ages of 8 and 10 are 7 times more likely than others to have symptoms of enduring psychological problems at the age of 12. In this study, both the bullied children and those who were not bullied had similar degrees of family adversity, previous psychological problems, and adverse experiences of parenting. Such research illustrates well the links between academic research and clinical practice. Results contribute to the understanding of the problem and of its development and stimulate work on developing effective treatments. There are many forms of cognitive behavioral interventions, and recent innovations include developments in the ways in which CBT interventions are administered, including self-help packages or computer programs that teach people to challenge their thinking or to experiment with new functional ways of behaving. Developments in the theory underlying CBT suggest that as much can be gained by changing the way we relate to our thoughts as by changing the content of our thinking. Hence, meditation techniques have been integrated with elements of CBT to form mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which has been shown to be effective in preventing relapse in those who have had recurrent episodes of depression. Techniques for changing styles of thinking, such as cognitive bias modification, are also being researched outside the clinic. 16. CBT, finding another way of seeing things. The wind was against them now, and Piglet's ears streamed behind him like banners as he fought his way along, and it seemed hours before he got them into the shelter of the 100-acre wood, and they stood up straight again, to listen, a little nervously, to the roaring of the gale among the tree tops. Supposing a tree fell down, Pooh, when we were underneath it? Supposing it didn't, said Pooh after careful thought. In summary, attempting to differentiate abnormal from normal behavior is not straightforward, What is considered abnormal depends on the context, on current values and norms, and on the ways in which normality and abnormality are conceptualized. Different ways of understanding normal personality and normal behavior will also influence how abnormality is understood and treated. Many factors contribute to causing psychological problems, including genetics, brain structure and chemistry, early experiences, learning history, unconscious conflicts, recent stressful or traumatic events, and thinking styles. Classification systems such as DSM aid communication and understanding, but their reliability and validity are still being questioned. Despite these difficulties, abnormal psychology has contributed much to the development of effective interventions. In considering which treatment is best, it is difficult to compare their efficacy accurately as they are not all equally amenable to testing. How do we measure the degree of unconscious conflict? The most demonstrably effective treatments are those like CBT that are based on testable theories and that have been evaluated using scientific methods, independent blind assessment of effects, experiments designed to test specific hypotheses, multiple standardized measurement of outcome, long-term follow-up, and appropriate comparison groups. At present, there is evidence that both psychological and drug treatments can be effective in ameliorating distressing symptoms. And psychological treatments such as CBT may have an advantage over drug treatments in terms of lower relapse rates. However, the effectiveness of all interventions varies according to the individual's presentation. Some conditions are more treatable than others, and factors such as the duration and severity of a problem affect the success of treatment. Alternatively, some presentations will warrant combined drug and psychological interventions, and there is a useful summary of current practical guidelines in a book called What Works for Whom, written jointly by a psychiatrist and a psychologist. It has been possible for abnormal psychology to develop in the way that it has partly because of advances made in other areas of psychology. Examples include understanding the ways in which perception and attention are influenced by moods, how one might be able to detect a signal without being aware of doing so, and become distressed without understanding why. How memories can be inaccurate as well as accurate, and how hard it can be to withstand the pressure of a peer group. A long series of experiments carried out with students in their first weeks at university has shown that writing about previous traumatic experiences for 2 15-minute periods, and some while after the actual event, is associated with better mental and physical health, and with better degree results 3 years later. This occurs even if no one ever reads what has been written or speaks to the students personally about those events. Why? The research continues. Thinking again about the hallucinations mentioned at the start of this chapter, research by cognitive neuroscientists suggests that these might arise from a disturbance in perceptual processes that interferes with the ability to separate considerations of experience and belief. Hallucinations might occur when error-dependent updating of inferences and beliefs about the world no longer functions as it should. The details of such hypotheses are too complex to be fully elaborated here. The point is that exploring the variables responsible for effects such as these can contribute to understanding what has happened when things go wrong, and potentially also to the development of new treatments. Future developments in abnormal psychology, whether they are directed towards improving treatments or preventing problems arising, will therefore not take place in isolation, and the ways in which they are applied will need to be subjected to similarly rigorous scientific and ethical standards. Chapter 9. How do we influence each other? Social psychology. Social interaction plays a crucial role in human evolution, in development, and in everyday social life, so there are numerous areas of social psychology to explore, such as group dynamics, bystander intervention, behavior of crowds, impression formation, the psychology of cheating and deceit, and of social behavior. The textbooks by Hogg and Vaughan and by Casson, Fine, and Marcus are good sources. It is clear that we must have a social brain, but the mechanisms involved in understanding the mental state of others are not yet fully understood. Cognitive neuroscientists studying social interaction in the relatively new field of social neuroscience are still developing research paradigms to allow analysis of brain activity during the reciprocal interplay between people. The assumption is that the computations made in the brain during social interactions will resemble those made during basic cognitive and emotional processes, combined in a manner specific to social interaction. Studies have produced some intriguing results. For example, cells have been observed in monkeys and birds which fire both when an animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by another animal, and brain activity consistent with this has been observed in humans. These could be part of a mirror neuron system specialized for understanding the behavior of others. Activity in these cells could help us to engage with their emotions and allow us to grasp their intentions. Similarly, imitating an action, as even newborn babies do, allows the possibility of experiencing something like the feelings, intentions, and sensations of someone else. Before such work became possible, social behavior, and the ways in which we influence each other, was studied at a very different level, exploring indirect as well as direct influences. You do not need a social psychologist to tell you that people do things when alone that they would not dream of doing in public, or behave quite differently in the company of friends than they would with colleagues. This impact on human behavior of the presence of others has been called social facilitation due to the initial observations that the presence of others enhance performance on simple tasks. One obvious form of social facilitation is competition. In general, performance is enhanced if people believe that they are competing with others, even if there is no prize. It seems that the mere presence of others, rather than the atmosphere of competition, is the crucial element. Even when people are asked not to compete, they work faster when they can see others working, or when they are being observed by others. Experiments have shown that social facilitation can be produced by simply telling the person that others are performing the same task elsewhere. Hence, your motivation to study may be increased by hearing that a classmate is already hard at it. Social facilitation has been demonstrated in animals too. Even cockroaches run faster when they are being watched by their peers. More direct forms of social influence involve attempting to change the behavior of others. This happens when someone tries to influence the group as a whole, when several group members encourage others to adopt a particular attitude, when an authority figure tries to achieve compliance to their demands, or when the attitudes of one group influence behavior towards another group. This chapter focuses on these four types of behavior. A born leader. It was originally thought that leadership was a trait that some people possessed and others did not, hence the term, a born leader. A number of attributes, such as height, weight, intelligence, confidence, and charisma, have been proposed as being related to leadership, though none of them consistently distinguishes leaders from non-leaders. Even intelligence is only slightly higher in typical leaders than in the average group member, and we can all think of leaders who are not particularly charismatic, so psychologists have explored other possibilities. First, leadership style has been shown to influence the behavior and productivity of group members. In general, a participative style, which attempts to involve all in decision-making, promotes high productivity with good relationships between group members. A more authoritarian, directive style allows group members less say in decisions and produces equal productivity, but tends to lead to poorer relationships and less cooperation. Laissez-faire leadership, which leaves the group to its own devices, results in lower productivity. The results of these studies have influenced the development of management strategies which encourage a move away from authoritarian models towards the more egalitarian process of allowing workers to have a say in the running of the organization. Research on the situational aspects of leadership suggests that leadership is primarily determined by the functions that the group needs a leader to fulfill, and there is some evidence to support this notion. For example, more directive, task-oriented leadership produces greater benefits when conditions are more extreme. This may help to explain the frequency of dictators as leaders in countries that are experiencing times of extreme hardship. To find out more about situational influences on leadership, psychologists have studied the effects of putting a random person in a central position. Experiments have shown that if members of a group are forced to communicate only through one central person, then that person begins to function as a leader, sending more messages, solving problems faster, making fewer errors, and becoming more satisfied with the efforts made. People put in positions of leadership tend to accept the challenge, behave like leaders, and be recognized by others as leaders. This may explain why people who do not appear to be natural leaders can nevertheless rise to the occasion. Conformity. Understanding leadership helps to explain the effect of an individual on a group, but the effects of a group on an individual are also of interest. You may have noticed that if several people have already given the same answer to a question, the last person is unlikely to disagree, and a hung jury is a fairly rare occurrence. Conformity is the act of matching attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to group norms. Conformity is often associated with youth culture, but actually affects all ages, and there are obvious benefits to society of conforming to group norms. Early investigations of the human desire to agree with the majority view found that over time an individual's opinions tended to fall into line with it, particularly in situations that were ambiguous. It was suggested that this reflects how social norms develop to provide a common frame of reference. Solomon Asch furthered this work by asking people to pick which of 3 lines was the same length as a given example. The group included stooges. The results showed that most of the participants conformed at least some of the time, and on average people conformed to the wrong answer a third of the time. Subsequent experiments showed that the degree of conformity was influenced by the ambiguity of the task and by the unanimity of the group. The dissent of even one person reduced conformity. There are different levels of conformity. In Asch's experiments, it turned out that some of those who conformed knew they were giving the wrong answer but did so because they didn't want to disagree, they feared social disapproval, or they feared that they would mess up the experiment. This level of conformity is also called compliance. As one might expect, rates of hand washing after going to the toilet are lower when people believe they are not being observed, as sometimes people are complying rather than internalizing the value. In contrast, deeper levels of conformity, also called identification or internalization, involve taking on board the opinions of another or of a group. This is strongest when the source is perceived to be expert, or at least credible, and when the task is difficult and urgent. In a crisis or emergency, we will do whatever the doctor says. Indeed, levels of conformity vary according to many factors, including gender, culture, and situational factors. Obedience. Complying with the demands of an authority figure is called obedience, and scientific investigations of it were originally prompted by atrocities committed during wars, such as the Holocaust or the killing of Vietnamese civilians at My Lai. After these wars, it became apparent that many soldiers, who appeared to be ordinary decent people, had committed atrocious, illegal acts. When asked why they had done these things, a common defense was, "I was following orders." Psychologists investigating obedience looked at just how far the average person will go, simply because they are told to do so. Box 22 describes a famous experiment investigating obedience in the general public, which is illustrated in Figure 18. 17. Resistance to majority opinion. All of the group members except the man 6 from the left are Confederates instructed to give uniformly wrong answers on 12 of the 18 trials. Number 6, who has been told he is participating in an experiment in visual judgment, therefore finds himself a lone dissenter when he gives the correct answers. The participant, showing the strain of repeated disagreement with the majority, leans forward anxiously to look at the test materials. Unusually, this participant persists in his opinion, saying that he has to call them as he sees them. Many aspects of civilized life, such as the legal, military, and school systems, rely on people obeying the instructions of authority figures, and it has even been suggested that obedience to authority is vital for communal life and may have been built into our genetic makeup during evolution. However, psychological factors also play a part. For example, in Milgram's experiments, politeness conventions may have made it difficult for the participants to refuse to continue once they had started. Or refusing to continue may have meant admitting that giving painful shocks to others was wrong and suggest that they disapproved of the experimenter. This makes it easier to understand why so few people disobey orders during war, when punishments for disobedience are more serious. Box 22. Extremes of obedience. Members of the public were recruited to participate in a study of memory. Participants were told that they would play the role of teacher and would be teaching a series of word pairs to a learner. Teachers were instructed to press a lever to deliver an electric shock to the learner for every error made. Teachers saw learners being strapped into an electrically wired chair with an electrode placed on their wrist, and being given a sample shock of 45 volts to convince them of the generator's authenticity. Then, seated in front of the generator with 30 switches ranging from 15 volts, mild shock, to 450 volts, danger, severe shock, teachers were told to move up a level for each error made. The experimenter remained in the room throughout. The learner was an actor who did not receive shocks but who had been trained to respond as if he had, and briefed to make many errors. As the shocks became stronger, the actor began to shout and swear. At the level marked extreme intensity shock, the actor went quiet and stopped responding to questions. Not surprisingly, many participants objected and asked to stop the experiment. The experimenter simply instructed them to continue. A staggering 65% continued right to the end of the shock series, 450 volts, and none stopped before 300 volts. The results of this experiment suggested that ordinary people will go very far indeed when they are instructed to do so by someone perceived to be in a position of authority. The presence of the experimenter increased obedience. When instructions were issued by telephone, obedience dropped from 65 to 21%, and several participants cheated by giving weaker shocks. Milgram. 18. Milgram's experiment on obedience. Top left, the shock generator. Top right, the victim is strapped into the electric chair. Bottom left, a subject receives the sample shock before starting the teaching session. Bottom right, unusually, this subject refuses to go on with the experiment. Two other factors, which are also relevant to the obedience seen during wars, affected obedience in these experiments. First, people are more prepared to inflict pain if they can distance themselves from the victim, where the teacher had to force the learner's hand down onto a shock plate. Obedience was much lower than when not required to see or touch the learner. This has parallels with modern weapons which can be fired at the touch of a button at an invisible enemy, causing invisible suffering. Indeed, it may be psychologically easier at the time to kill millions with a nuclear missile than to kill one person face to face. Second, believing the violence to be a means to an end in a worthy cause, or to have ideological justification, increases obedience both in the laboratory and in a war zone. In the experiments, participants believed that they were contributing to scientific research. When the experiment was repeated without the associations of a prestigious university, obedience rates dropped. Prejudice. Social psychology is also concerned with interactions between groups, and psychologists have suggested that dividing people into ethnic groups and stereotyping behavior according to group membership may have had evolutionary advantages. Indeed, brain imaging studies showed greater amygdala activation in the response of Caucasians to black faces, and this correlated with prejudiced attitudes, but only for unknown black faces, not for familiar black faces. One hypothesis is that stereotyping according to racial groups may originally have been a primitive method of threat detection. Box 23 describes one of the many experiments that have investigated how belonging to a particular group can change behavior. Despite its artificiality, this experiment has many implications for prejudice in the real world. Prejudices are relatively enduring attitudes about a group that are extended towards all members of that group. Prejudice often involves stereotyping, that is, the tendency to categorize people according to some readily identifiable characteristics such as age, race, sex, or occupation, and then to attribute to the individual the characteristics that are supposedly typical of members of that group. For example, someone who is prejudiced against women may believe that women are stupid and weak, and they will apply this belief to every woman they encounter. While the stereotypes involved in prejudices may contain a grain of truth, they are frequently overly general. Some women are stronger than some men, overly rigid. Not all women are weak or stupid, or simply inaccurate. There is no evidence that women are less intelligent than men. Box 23. Are blue or brown eyes better? Some 8-year-old children were invited by their teacher to take part in an exercise that would help them better understand racism. She told them that those with brown eyes were more intelligent and better people than those with blue eyes. She then gave the brownies special privileges such as extra helpings at lunch and extra play time, and denigrated the blueies by saying that they were less intelligent, dirty, shifty, and lazy. Blueies were made to wear a special collar so they could be easily identified. Behavior in both groups changed. The blueies showed signs of lowered self-esteem and depressed mood, and did less well in their work, while the brownies became critical and oppressive towards their inferiors. After a few days, the teacher said that she had made a mistake, and the blueies were in fact the superior ones, and the behavior patterns reversed. Of course, the exercise and its real aim were fully explained to the children once